So in the last few videos, we've predominantly been talking about sending transactions. And to conclude this section, we're going to talk about sending coins with automated raw transactions. Previously, we've described how to do simple transactions with commands such as send address to, and we've also detailed ways to send transactions in a slightly more dangerous way using raw transactions. And in this final section, we're going to split the difference by showing how to make transactions simpler and safer. So in essence, we're going to be using the fund raw transaction command, which essentially lets Bitcoin calculate everything for you. So it will calculate what inputs or UTXOs used to fund your transactions, as well as any transaction fees associated with that transaction. It's recommended that in order to use this command, you ensure that your Bitcoin configuration has rational variables used to calculate the transaction fees. So what that means is by default, your Bitcoin configuration will use a minimum transaction fee of about 0.001 BTC and a transaction confirmation target of around 6. So we'll wait till our transaction is 6 blocks deep before we can be confident that it won't be reversed. But if you'd like to speed up the tutorial slightly, then you can set a slightly higher minimum transaction fee. So if you head over to your Bitcoin configuration and add the variables min transaction fee and set it to maybe 0.001 and set the transaction confirmation target, so transaction confirm target, and set that equal to 1, and you basically be able to see within a couple of minutes if your transaction has been verified or not. But I won't do that. I don't mind waiting to see if the transaction has been confirmed, waiting a little bit longer to see if that's happened. So that's fine for now. So the first thing we need to do is create a bare bones raw transaction, and this is before we can use the fund raw transaction command. And basically, when we use the create raw transaction command now, we won't give it any inputs and we won't give it a change address to use. But we still need to send it to a recipient, and we still need to specify how much we'd like to send. So if you don't already have an address you'd like to send to, I recommend storing it in a variable like we've done in previous videos, and sending an amount that is obviously less than what you have in your wallet. So I'm going to just copy over my command for creating a raw transaction, and like we've been doing previously, we're going to use the create raw transaction command. We're going to save it in a variable called unfinished transaction, and this time our JSON array, or the first parameter called inputs, is our JSON array. We're just going to leave it blank for now. I've set the recipient in a variable, which is just an address for a testnet faucet, and this final argument is the amount of Bitcoin to send, or this final value rather is the amount of Bitcoin to send. So I'm going to send 0.1 and press enter. And now we can actually fund our transaction using the fund or transaction command. So I'll clear my terminal and type Bitcoin CLI, use the named flag, and type fund raw transaction, and the value it takes, or what it takes as parameter, is a hex string, which was returned from creating our raw transaction. So the variable we stored that in was called unfinished transaction, or TX, and what gets returned is three things: a hex key, which is the hex encoded string of our transaction, the fee key, which is how much we spent in fees, and the position of our change address. So to make this a bit nicer, we can use JQ to pipe the result of our transaction and store it in a variable, or store the hex encoded string in a variable. So I'll use JQ this time. Oops. So I want to copy that one. Cool. So again, we're just doing the same thing. Call this one raw transaction hex 3. We're using a fun raw transaction, but this time we're just gonna pipe it through JQ, and in the response we're going to take the hex key. So if we press enter, and then finally what we can do is, this does seem like, I guess at this point it seems like a little bit of magic, like where it's automatically finding out which UTXOs we need to fund the transaction. It's creating a change address for us. It's calculating the transaction fees for us. So because it's the first time we're using it, we might just want to check that all of those things have happened and they are correct. So what we can do is use the decode raw transaction to just dig a little deeper into what's happening. So let's do that. So Bitcoin CLI named, and we're going to call decode raw transaction. And this takes again a hex string, and our hex string was called raw hex 3, I believe. If I spell named right. Name decode raw transaction. Let me copy this over because I might have a few typos. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Cool. So like we've seen previously, this gives us a bit more information about our transaction, such as the transaction ID and the hash, as well as all of the inputs that we use to fund this transaction in this section here. And if we scroll down, and the output. So I sent 0.1 BTC to this address, so you just verify that that's correct. And then these are all of the UTXOs essentially that were used to fund this transaction. So this transaction doesn't actually have a change address associated with it, because in our outputs we can only see the address that we're sent to. So I guess that means that the fund raw transaction command used a set of UTXOs that equal the exact amount that we need to send, including a fee. And so it's not generated a change address for us. But in some cases that won't always be what's going to happen. You will get a change address, and you can use the validate address command, passing in your address to just double check that that address is yours. Because what will be returned is an is mine key, and that will tell you whether or not that change address is yours. So now that we've created a raw transaction, we just go through a similar process to what we've done in the past by signing the raw transaction. So we'll go ahead and do that and store that in a variable as well. So we're using the sign raw transaction with wallet command, passing in our hex string and piping it through JQ to pull out the hex string that gets returned from this command. And then we can just call our send raw transaction command with the signed hex string. and that returns a transaction ID which you can use to look inside Block Explorer, which is probably the recommended way to get a nice visual representation of what's happening with that transaction on the network. So if you must send funds with raw transactions, then fund raw transaction gives you like a nice alternative to whereby you don't have to calculate the fees and the inputs and the outputs. All of that stuff is done for you, and it prevents you essentially from accidentally losing a bunch of money. So why would you want to use automated raw transactions? I think one of the advantages is that it essentially allows you to have a nice balance between what we saw in one of the previous videos with the send to address, which doesn't really give you any control, and in some cases that's fine because you probably just want to send your transaction and you don't want to have to worry about any other variables. But with this fund raw transaction command, it does give you some of the advantages of raw transactions without maybe some of the dangers around miscalculation of fees or using wrong inputs and things of that nature. And although I guess one of the disadvantages are that the fund raw transaction command, and something that wasn't really mentioned in this video too much, is that the control is still quite limited. So you probably wouldn't want to use this command if you were writing a Bitcoin program where you needed to know exactly how everything was working, exactly what inputs you were using, exactly what fees were being associated with that transaction, and what change address was being generated and things of that nature. But it does provide like a happy medium if you just want to send a safe raw transaction. So I hope you enjoyed this little section on creating and sending Bitcoin transactions. And in the next section, we'll talk more about controlling Bitcoin transactions. So I hope this made sense. If you've got any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.